The rain fell steadily over London that evening, tapping against the tall windows of Mr. Alistair Fenwick's study like impatient fingers. Inside the elegant townhouse on Grosvenor Square, the clocks ticked in quiet harmonies, 6 of them, each mounted carefully on the panelled walls. Fenwick was known for many things in the city: his vast fortune, his cold precision in business, and most of all his extraordinary collection of antique clocks. At precisely 8 minutes past 9, the butler Graves climbed the stairs carrying a silver tray with a pot of freshly brewed tea. The study door was closed, which was not unusual. Mr. Fenwick often worked late and disliked interruptions. Graves knocked politely. "Your tea, sir." There was no response. He waited, then knocked again, slightly louder this time. Still nothing. With a faint frown, Graves tried the door. To his surprise, it swung open easily. The room was warm and softly lit by a brass desk lamp. Fenwick sat behind his large mahogany desk, his head slumped forward, one hand resting near a half-written letter. For a moment, Graves assumed the man had simply fallen asleep. Then he saw the dark stain spreading slowly across Fenwick's waistcoat. The tray crashed to the floor. Fenwick was dead. Within the hour, the police had sealed the house. Inspector Halstead stood in the center of the study, studying the strange scene with growing irritation. The door showed no sign of forced entry. The windows were locked from the inside. A small revolver lay on the carpet 3 feet from the desk. Yet no one had heard a gunshot. The medical examiner knelt beside the body and spoke quietly. Single bullet wound to the chest. Close range. Halstead rubbed his jaw. So we have a locked study, a dead man, and a weapon on the floor. Simple enough. But it was not simple. The revolver contained one empty chamber. Yet when the examiner examined Fenwick's body more closely, he frowned. "The bullet passed clean through," he said. Halstead blinked. And we haven't found it." They searched the room thoroughly. The bullet was nowhere to be found. But that was not the only oddity. Halstead walked slowly around the study, his eyes moving from object to object until something caught his attention. One of the clocks. He stepped closer. The clock above the fireplace had stopped. Its delicate brass hands were frozen at exactly 9:17. The inspector turned to Graves. "When did you find the body?" 8 minutes past 9, sir," the butler replied nervously. "I checked the hall clock as I came upstairs." Halstead glanced again at the stopped clock. "Yet this one says the gunshot happened at 17 minutes past 9. "Yes, sir. That would be 9 minutes after you found him dead." The butler swallowed. The inspector felt a familiar irritation forming. He disliked puzzles that made no sense. There were 6 clocks in the room, all antique pieces worth small fortunes. 5 of them ticked normally. Only one had stopped. And yet something about it felt deliberate. Halstead leaned closer. There were no signs of damage, no crack in the glass, no broken gears visible. The clock simply stopped. A constable entered the room. "Inspector, we've questioned the household staff. No one entered or left the study after dinner. Mr. Fenwick dismissed everyone at 8:30, so he was alone." "Yes, sir," Halstead sighed. "Any enemies?" "Many, but none in the house tonight." The inspector looked once more at the dead man, the revolver, and the silent clock. A murder in a locked room. A missing bullet. A clock that claimed the crime had not yet happened. Halstead muttered under his breath. Either this is the simplest case in London, or the cleverest lie a murderer has ever told. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the quiet study, 5 clocks ticked patiently forward, while the 6th remained frozen, stubbornly insisting that time itself had told the wrong story. The following morning the rain had stopped, leaving London wrapped in a pale grey mist that clung to the streets and softened the outlines of buildings. Inspector Halstead had slept poorly, his thoughts circling endlessly around the strange stillness of the clock and the missing bullet. By 9 o'clock he stood once again in Mr. Fenwick's study, arms folded, staring at the wall above the fireplace. The clock still read 9:17. It had not moved since the previous night. A constable entered quietly. "Sir, the gentleman you requested has arrived." Halstead nodded with mild reluctance. Send him in." Moments later, a small, impeccably dressed man stepped into the room with delicate precision. His suit was flawless, his shoes polished like mirrors, and his mustache, magnificent and symmetrical, seemed arranged with mathematical care. He paused just inside the doorway and surveyed the study with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Hercule Poirot," said the inspector dryly. "Thank you for coming." Poirot inclined his head politely. "My dear inspector, when one hears of a locked-room murder involving clocks and missing bullets, how could one resist? It is practically an invitation." Halsted gestured toward the desk. "Victim, Alistair Fenwick, shot last night sometime around 9. Butler discovered the body at 9:08. Poirot walked slowly across the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "And the weapon?" Halsted pointed toward the revolver resting in an evidence cloth on the desk. "One shot fired, but the bullets are gone." Poirot bent slightly, examining the revolver without touching it. His head tilted thoughtfully. "And the famous clock?" Halsted gave a faint sigh and nodded toward the fireplace. Poirot approached it with quiet curiosity. For several seconds he simply observed it. Then he smiled faintly. "Ah." The inspector frowned. "What?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead he turned slowly, letting his gaze wander across the entire study. The 6 clocks ticked in patient harmony. Tick, 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 except for one. Poirot moved toward the desk where Fenwick had died. The body had been removed earlier that morning, but the arrangement of the room remained untouched. He examined the half-written letter lying on the desk. His eyes flicked across the words. Then he glanced toward the carpet where the revolver had been found. "Tell me, Inspector," Poirot said calmly. When the butler entered, the weapon was exactly here. "Yes." "And the windows locked?" Poirot nodded. "Très bien." At that moment the butler, Graves, appeared in the doorway. "Inspector, the household staff you requested are assembled downstairs." Halsted nodded. "Well, speak with them shortly." Poirot turned to the butler with polite interest. "You discovered the body, yes?" "Yes, sir." "At 9:08. "That is correct." Poirot smiled gently. "You checked the hall clock?" "Yes, sir." Poirot's eyes sparkled slightly. "How admirable. A man who respects punctuality." Graves shifted uneasily. Poirot wandered slowly toward the fireplace again. "Tell me, Monsieur Graves, did Mr. Fenwick often adjust his clocks himself?" "Oh, yes, sir." "He was very particular about them, all 6. "Yeah." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting." Halsted crossed his arms. "If you've noticed something, Poirot, I'd appreciate hearing it." But Poirot was now crouching slightly beside the fireplace. His sharp eyes had settled on something small, very small. A thin scratch on the polished wood floor beneath the clock. Barely visible. He straightened slowly. Then he glanced upward at the frozen hands again. 9:17. Poirot murmured softly to himself. "Curious, very curious." Halsted looked impatient. "What is?" Poirot turned, his expression thoughtful. "My friend, at the moment I do not yet know what happened in this room." He paused. "But I am beginning to suspect that someone has been lying." The inspector sighed. "We already know that." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, no, Inspector." His gaze drifted once more toward the silent clock above the fireplace. "I do not mean a person." He tapped the air lightly with one finger. "I mean the clock." Poirot straightened and motioned politely for Inspector Halsted to follow him down the grand staircase. The rest of the household staff had been gathered in the drawing-room, a neat, formal space with heavy curtains drawn against the grey morning light. Each of them sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes flicking nervously from one to another. There was the cook, a stout woman with a flushed face, the housemaid, delicate and anxious the chauffeur, tall and taciturn Graves, who still held himself with the same careful restraint he had shown in the study. Poirot approached them slowly, his gaze sharp yet measured. "Mes amis," he began, "I wish to understand the sequence of events last night, but let us speak calmly and precisely, for even the smallest detail may hide the truth." The cook, Mrs. Hensley, spoke first. Her voice was high and quivering. "I went to bed early, monsieur. I did not hear anything unusual. I only learned of Mr. Fenwick's death when Graves came to fetch tea." "Nothing at all?" Poirot pressed gently. "No voices, no doors opening, no steps?" "Nothing, monsieur." "I swear it." She clutched her apron. Poirot nodded, but his eyes flicked to Graves, who stood silently, face pale. "And you, Monsieur Graves, you discovered the body?" "Yes, sir." "I went to deliver the tea. He was sitting there at his desk. Then I called for help immediately." "Of course," Poirot murmured. His eyes lingered on the man for a long moment. "And tell me, was anyone else in the house at the time?" Graves hesitated slightly. "No, sir. The household retired early. Only Mr. Fenwick remained." Poirot straightened and turned to the chauffeur, Mr. Talbot. "And you? When did you last see your employer?" "I left the premises at 8:30, Talbot replied smoothly. "Mr. Fenwick was in his study. I returned briefly to check the stables, but the house was quiet. I heard nothing unusual." Poirot's small, keen eyes narrowed. "Ah." "And yet, Inspector, he passed near the study door exactly when Monsieur Graves claims to have entered." Halstead frowned. "That's right." Poirot's gaze swept the room again, and the housemaid, Miss Eldridge, the young woman bit her lip, twisting her fingers together. "Two was arranging the bedrooms. I didn't go near the study, sir. I only heard a faint clatter, like a tray or something falling." She hesitated. "It was very soft, and I wasn't certain of it." Poirot raised a finger delicately. "Fascinating." He pivoted to address them all. "Do you see, my friends, how each account is precise, yet each differs in the smallest details? It is here, in these discrepancies, that the truth whispers." Mrs. Hensley shifted uncomfortably. "But, monsieur, we all went to bed. Why would anyone lie?" Poirot smiled thinly. "Ah, but one does not always lie consciously. Sometimes the mind hides things even from the speaker. Or, perhaps, there is fear of revealing more than one knows." He paused, letting the words hang. His eyes flicked again to Graves. The butler's posture was rigid, his expression carefully neutral. Yet Poirot noticed the subtle twitch of his left hand, the brief avoidance of eye contact when the clock was mentioned. "And you, Inspector," Poirot continued, "have you verified the movements of each person thoroughly?" Halstead nodded. "We have, Monsieur Poirot, but there are no obvious leads. Everyone seems to have an alibi, at least a plausible account." Poirot raised a delicate finger to his temple. "Plausible, yes, but plausibility is not truth. Listen carefully, my friends, to the rhythm of each story. Observe the hesitations, the eagerness to cooperate, the small contradictions. One may be too keen to please, another too cautious to speak, yet all contain pieces of the puzzle. And somewhere hidden in these small inconsistencies lies the path to justice for poor Monsieur Fenwick." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Poirot's gaze swept over them, unrelenting, as though he could peer into the very thoughts behind their eyes. Each one now seemed a suspect, though none bore the obvious marks of guilt. Still, he sensed the invisible threads of deception winding through their words, delicate but tangible. "Ah," Poirot murmured softly, almost to himself, "the human heart is a clever thing. It lies, even when the tongue tells the truth. And it is there, in the quiet contradictions, that the mystery of the clock that lied may finally begin to unravel." Poirot returned to the study, moving deliberately among the clocks, as if their steady ticking might whisper secrets he alone could hear. He let the staff descend to the servants' quarters, their uneasy glances following him, but he remained alone, allowing his mind to work. Time, he reflected, was a very subtle accomplice. It could hide a lie or reveal it, depending on how one listened. He began to consider the web of motives surrounding Mr. Fenwick. The man had not been popular. His fortune, vast and carefully accumulated, made him many enemies. His business dealings were notorious for their ruthlessness. Employees who had been dismissed abruptly, acquaintances slighted in social circles, even distant relatives, all might wish him ill. But which among them had the opportunity and the cunning to orchestrate a murder that seemed to defy the very laws of time? He started with Graves, the butler. Reliable, careful, yet a man who spent years serving a master he neither admired nor loved. Gratitude can mask resentment, and resentment can breed opportunity. Poirot noted the subtle tension in Graves' hands as he recounted discovering the body. He was a man disciplined enough to hide emotion, yet small gestures, the twitch of a finger, a half-turned gazes suggested he was concealing something. Perhaps a secret he had observed, or perhaps his own involvement. Then there was Talbot, the chauffeur, whose face betrayed nothing yet, whose statement seemed almost rehearsed. He left the premises at 8:30, yet claimed to hear nothing unusual. Was it possible he had returned unnoticed, orchestrated the crime, and departed before discovery? Poirot considered the logistics of such an action, but more importantly, he questioned the motive. Talbot had long been paid generously, yet any man can grow bitter under subservience, especially when proximity to wealth fosters envy. Miss Eldridge, the young housemaid, introduced a different layer entirely. Nervous and fragile, she seemed almost eager to avoid attention, yet her hesitation over the faint noise she claimed to hear was intriguing. Could fear alone cause someone to misreport their observations, or was it a clever ploy to conceal knowledge of a critical detail? And Mrs. Hensley, the cook, with her forthright denials, presented the opposite extremian air of innocence so strong it nearly seemed defensive. Greed might seem an unlikely motive for her, yet domestic staff often knows more about a household's inner workings than any outsider could guess. Who had access to the study? Who knew the habits of Mr. Fenwick's clocks, the precise moment he dismissed staff, the small details that might allow a crime to occur unnoticed? Poirot moved to the desk, tracing the edge of the polished surface where the letter had lain. He mused over the content, half-written and abandoned, wondering if it hinted at yet another secret threat, a betrayal, perhaps even a confession. The missing bullet, the silent clock, and now the multiple suspects all were threads that could be pulled, but no single thread explained the full tapestry of deceit. He tapped his fingers lightly together. Greed, yes, there were those who might benefit from Fenwick's death. Revenge abundant, considering slights and betrayals. Jealousy subtle, simmering beneath carefully composed expressions. Fear most of all, fear of exposure or punishment, a potent motivator for concealment. Each suspect's account intersected with one or more of these motives, yet none fit perfectly. The crime was a maze, and every path seemed plausible, yet incomplete. Poirot's eyes drifted back to the clocks. Each tick, each pause, seemed almost to mock him, insisting that truth lay not just in human intent, but in the precise measurement of time. He began to sketch, in his mind, a mental map of suspects, motives, and possible sequences of events, each connection delicate and interwoven. The human heart is a labyrinth, he murmured to himself, and in this labyrinth, every path is lined with shadows. But patience, observation, and the little grey cells, they will illuminate the secret, one careful step at a time. He straightened and took a deep breath, feeling the rhythm of the clocks settle around him. One by one, he would untangle the motives, probe the lies, and expose the hidden hand behind the murder. But for now, the maze remained complex, tangled, and waiting for the first thread to unravel. By late afternoon, the investigation had taken on a sense of urgency. Inspector Halstead had grown increasingly confident after the discovery of a peculiar object near the fireplace, a small, folded scrap of paper that had somehow escaped the initial sweep. It contained a hastily scrawled note, partially legible. "The clock will tell all. Wait until 9:17. The inspector presented it to the staff with a mixture of triumph and relief. "We have our clue," he declared. "It confirms what we suspected. Someone here planned the crime around the clocks." The household collectively exhaled, some faces showing apprehension, others a measure of vindication, as if a mystery that had tormented them for hours was suddenly on the verge of resolution. Poirot, however, remained in the study, his small hands folded delicately behind his back, his gaze fixed on the stopped clock above the fireplace. The note was certainly interesting, but there was something about it that did not align with the rhythm of the crime. Halstead, eager to close the case, moved quickly. "Graves, the butler you are to remain at the station for further questioning. Everyone else will be cleared for now." Case nearly solved. Graves' expression was calm, yet Poirot noticed a faint flicker, almost imperceptible, tightening around the eyes. As the inspector left the room, Poirot approached the clock again, his gaze now acute, precise. He studied the scratch beneath it, the position of the hands, the faint fingerprints on the glass, and even the subtle pattern of dust around the base. He tapped lightly with his finger. "Mon Dieu," he murmured softly. "The answer is not in the note. It is too simple, too obvious. The note is a distraction, placed with elegance to mislead those who are eager for victory." The detective's eyes wandered back to the study's floor. He crouched carefully, examining the space beneath the desk. There was a faint indentation in the carpet, too large to have been made by the revolver alone, too precise to be accidental. He traced it lightly with a finger. Poirot's lips curled in a small, knowing smile. Oh. The trap is clever, yes, but a trap is always laid with impatience for discovery. Whoever placed the note wishes to be praised for foresight, to direct suspicion elsewhere, while the true culprit watches silently, confident that all eyes are distracted. Hours passed, and the inspector returned with a sense of closure, parading the note like a trophy. He announced to the household that a suspect had been identified, and the case would soon be resolved. Relief and whispers swept through the room. Yet Poirot remained silent, his eyes lingering on every detail, the subtle angle of the desk, the minute dust patterns on the shelves, the way the sunlight struck the brass hands of the still clock. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Inspector, a word, s'il vous plaît." Halstead paused, impatient. "What now, Poirot?" "The note confirms everything. We have our culprit." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, mon ami. Victory is too easily claimed here. A note left as an invitation to triumph is rarely the confession it appears to be. Something does not align: the timing, the hands of the clock, the position of objects. The puzzle is incomplete. The real crime remains hidden, like a shadow that refuses to show itself until the last moment." Halstead frowned. "You're saying we've been misled?" "Precisely," Poirot said softly, almost in a whisper. "A clever hand wishes to appear innocent while the eyes of the world look elsewhere. Patience, my friend. The criminal waits, confident, while others cheer a false victory. But the truth, it will speak. And when it does, it will speak with clarity." As the afternoon sun faded, the study grew dim, the clocks ticking steadily, except for the one that refused to move. In its silent insistence, Poirot felt the pulse of the deception, the hidden rhythm of a mind at work, just out of reach, confident that the game had been won. And yet he knew, with absolute certainty, that the final act had not yet begun. Somewhere beyond the polished floors and ticking brass, the true culprit lingered, waiting for the moment when the shadows would grant them their advantage. Poirot straightened, smoothing his suit, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. "Ah, yes. Patience and the little grey cells. They will reveal the path. But not today, not yet. The game continues, and the clock that lied still holds its secret." Poirot returned to his lodgings that evening, his mind still revolving around the false victory the police had celebrated. The note, the misaligned hands of the clock, the neat but misleading clues all pointed to a criminal who understood human nature as well as the mechanisms of time itself. As he sat in his chair, hands clasped delicately over his stomach, he allowed himself a rare indulgence, reflection. He thought of Mr. Fenwick's life, which from the surface seemed orderly and disciplined. Yet beneath that polished exterior there had been rumblings of small disputes, quiet resentments, business rivals whose names had appeared in newspapers years ago, and the occasional mention of family tensions that were quickly hushed. It was the familiar pattern of power and privilege. The past seldom remained buried. Poirot rose and retrieved a small notebook he carried for such occasions. Flipping through pages of past cases, he came upon a report from nearly a decade prior to the investigation into the disappearance of a minor heir in a provincial town. The case had been deemed resolved when the missing person was found abroad, unharmed, and the trail went cold. But Poirot's sharp memory recalled one curious footnote, a mention of a household staff member whose testimony had seemed strangely rehearsed. Yet the officer at the time had accepted it without question. A sudden intuition pricked at him. He retrieved the staff register from the Fenwick household, noting dates and tenures. His eyes fell upon a single line. Graves had been employed as a junior footman at a country estate during the very period of that old disappearance. His service record had been flawless, and yet, in that distant report, the footman had been one of the last to see the missing heir before the disappearance. Poirot's moustache twitched with a hint of satisfaction. Connections, he realized, were not always immediate. They were threads, sometimes invisible until the right tension revealed the pattern. Graves, the disciplined and unassuming butler, was linked to an event long forgotten, a detail that had been overlooked precisely because it seemed irrelevant. He studied the rest of the household again. Talbot, the chauffeur, had once worked for Fenwick's competitors, and there had been a financial dispute that resulted in his reassignment. Miss Eldridge had once been a companion to a wealthy relative who had had grievances with Fenwick. Mrs. Hensley's nephew had been dismissed from Fenwick's firm under suspicious circumstances. Individually, these details seemed minor, disconnected, but together they formed a lattice of old resentments and grievances, converging quietly in the present. Poirot allowed himself a moment to imagine the sequence. Each person's past, each small slight or old humiliation, could have been carefully leveraged to orchestrate a scenario that would mislead the authorities. The crime was not merely the expression of a moment's impulse, it was the culmination of years, patiently constructed, so that the threads of history would intersect in this study on that rainy night. He returned to the study in his mind, picturing the silent clock, the fallen revolver, and the precise placement of each object. The scratch beneath the clock, the perfectly folded note, the hesitation in Graves' demeanor, all were pieces of a larger design that had begun long ago. Poirot smiled faintly, the edges of his mustache twitching. "Ah, yes," he murmured. "The present is never isolated. It carries the weight of the past, and those who understand this, who plan with patience, create illusions that seem impossible to unravel. But patience, and the careful observation of human nature, they reveal everything." He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing briefly. The shadows of the past had spoken. Now he knew that the crime in Grosvenor Square was not simply about greed or opportunity, it was a convergence of old grievances, meticulously timed and orchestrated by a mind that had waited for the perfect moment to act. The threads were beginning to pull taut, and Poirot could feel that the resolution, though still distant, was drawing ever closer. The little grey cells were at work. The past and present were converging in a precise rhythm, and soon, he knew, the hidden hand behind the murder would be revealed, whether the world was ready or not. The following morning, Poirot returned to Grosvenor Square with the precision of a man who had already mapped the contours of a puzzle only he could see. The house was quiet, the staff uneasy in the lingering shadow of yesterday's false victory. Inspector Halstead, hopeful and still convinced they were close to closure, met him at the door. "Monsieur Poirot," he said briskly, "the household is assembled." "Are we to question Graves further?" Poirot shook his head gently. "Patience, mon ami. Sometimes the truth reveals itself not through repeated questions but through a little experiment." He allowed a faint smile to tug at his lips. The household was gathered in the drawing-room again, stiff with anticipation. Poirot moved to the center of the room, fingers steepled. "Mes amis," he began, "we are all aware that Mr. Fenwick's death was unusual. The clocks, the note, the missing bullet, all elements carefully arranged. Yet I believe the culprit has made one small miscalculation. The human heart is difficult to govern." He held up a small brass pendulum he had retrieved from his coat pocket. "I wish to demonstrate something. This pendulum swings with perfect regularity. It is honest, but the eyes that watch it, they are not always so honest." He set the pendulum on a low table, allowing it to swing freely. Each staff member's gaze followed the movement, their expressions polite yet wary. Poirot's sharp eyes swept over them, noting the subtle reactions, the quickened breathing, the slight narrowing of eyes, the twitch of fingers. "Now," Poirot said softly, "imagine the pendulum as time itself. Each tick represents a moment when one must choose truth or deception. We shall play a simple game. I will ask a question. You may answer honestly or dishonestly, but I shall watch the rhythm of your mind, the way your body betrays what the tongue conceals." He began with innocuous questions. "Who last polished the silver tray in the study? Which clock do you prefer?" Each question drew careful, composed responses. But Poirot's gaze lingered on Graves. The butler's responses were impeccable, yet his left hand clenched involuntarily once, the moment he was asked about the study's arrangement the previous evening. Poirot paused, tilting his head. "Ah, Monsieur Graves, you are precise. But even the most disciplined hand can reveal a secret. Tell me, if someone wished to hide an object in plain sight, where might it be placed in this room?" Graves hesitated. A faint flush rose to his temples. His eyes darted briefly toward the fireplace, then to the far corner near the desk. His voice, when it came, was measured but almost too careful. "Perhaps beneath the desk, monsieur, or behind the bookcase." Poirot smiled very slightly. "Indeed, Very clever. And yet, mon ami, cleverness is not perfection. It is only human. The pendulum does not lie, nor do small gestures. You see, a mind burdened with concealment reacts even when words are composed. A twitch, a glance, a hesitation, these are cracks, openings through which truth escapes. The room remained tense, but Poirot's eyes never left Graves. The butler shifted his weight, and Poirot caught the subtle curve of his mouth, a flash of something like guilt, quickly masked. "Ah," Poirot murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "There it is, the smallest imperfection in an otherwise flawless facade, a detail overlooked by those who are too eager to claim victory. And yet it is enough." Inspector Halstead leaned forward, puzzled. "Enough for what, Poirot?" Poirot's gaze never wavered from Graves. "Enough to tell me that the true solution lies not in the note, not in the clocks alone, but in the one who believes all eyes are deceived. The pendulum has swung, the heart has betrayed itself, and now, mon ami, the investigation may proceed to where it should have begun." He stepped back, allowing the pendulum to swing between them, its steady rhythm marking the passage of time and the revelation of hidden truths waiting to be claimed. The first real crack in the carefully constructed deception had appeared, and Poirot's little grey cells were already following it, relentlessly, toward the final unveiling. Poirot barely slept that night. The image of Graves' subtle hesitation haunted him, the flicker of guilt that had betrayed a careful mask. By morning he returned to Grosvenor Square, the crisp air outside sharp against his thoughts, each step measured, deliberate. Inspector Halstead was already waiting, triumphant once more, though Poirot's eyes betrayed nothing of his own satisfaction. The study was quiet, but as they entered, Poirot immediately noticed something wrong. The desk drawers, which he had examined only the previous evening, were slightly ajar, as though disturbed in haste. The revolver, carefully secured in evidence yesterday, had been removed. The folded note of one that had seemed a tantalizing clue was gone. Halstead's face paled. "Stolen. Who are you?" Poirot walked slowly toward the desk, his gaze sweeping the floor, the bookshelves, the corners of the room. "Ah, mon ami," he said softly. "The game grows more interesting." He crouched, tracing the faint dust disturbed along the edges of the desk. "Look here, see the scuff marks? They are recent and deliberate. Someone entered this room when the household was unaware and removed what they knew was dangerous to their secret." The inspector's frustration was audible. "But the house has been sealed, the staff are all accounted for." Poirot's eyes flicked toward the windows, locked as before. "Yes." "Precisely. It is a crime committed from within, one who moves like a shadow, who knows the rhythms of this house, and who believes their hand is invisible." He straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his hands. "The thief has acted to prevent us from following the thread of truth too closely. They have confidence, my friend, and confidence is often arrogance disguised as control." He surveyed the remaining staff, who had now been summoned again. Each faced him with polite, anxious curiosity. He let his gaze linger, slow and deliberate, drawing subtle reactions from the group. Some shifted uncomfortably, others pretended composure. But Poirot's eyes found what he sought: the slight tightening of the jaw, the subtle avoidance of eye contact, the tension in a hand that had just brushed a sleeve nervously. "Ah," Poirot murmured, "this is why one must never celebrate too soon. The thief has not only taken the evidence, but also tested the resolve of those who would uncover the truth. Observer fear reveals itself in small, almost imperceptible ways. And fear is the companion of guilt." Halstead glanced around nervously. "Well, search the house again. Surely the missing items are hidden somewhere." Poirot shook his head slightly, a small smile playing at his lips. "Ah, my dear Inspector, that is exactly what they wish you to do. The act of searching will disturb nothing, for the evidence is already moved or destroyed. What remains is observation, deduction, and patience. The criminal believes the path is blocked, yet they forget one principle. The human mind cannot erase its own miscalculations." He moved toward the mantelpiece, letting his gaze linger on the frozen clock. Even now, the pendulum swings steadily elsewhere, marking time with truth. Yet the hands here remain still, as if the room itself waits for the next revelation. Poirot turned slowly toward the staff, his sharp eyes settling on Graves. One among you understands that the note and revolver were dangerous. One among you acted not out of desperation but calculation. The question is, who? A sudden tremor ran through Graves' composure, barely perceptible but enough. Poirot noted it with satisfaction. Ah! The smallest imperfection in a practiced demeanor, a subtle crack that betrays the mind behind the action. The vanishing evidence has escalated the stakes, yes, but it has also illuminated the heart of the matter, if one only observes closely. Halsted exhaled, exasperated yet intrigued. So, we're back to the beginning? Poirot's eyes gleamed. None, Inspector. We are far from the beginning. We are now at the moment when the criminal, confident in their deception, has revealed the very thing they hoped to conceal. The game has changed, and it is in such moments that the final threads of truth are often found. The room remained tense, the clocks ticking, and the missing evidence cast a shadow over the investigation. Yet Poirot's mind, as always, was already at work tracing the faintest tremors, calculating the subtle patterns of fear and deception, and preparing to unravel the final hidden design. The day had barely begun when a shrill scream echoed from the upper floors of Grosvenor Square, cutting through the hushed tension that had settled over the household. Poirot, already alert from the previous day's disruptions, moved with remarkable speed for a man of his careful demeanor, followed closely by Inspector Halsted. They arrived in the corridor to find the housemaid, Miss Eldridge, trembling, her hands clutched at her chest. It's Mrs. Hensley, sir," she stammered. She's gone from the kitchen!" Poirot's eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping the corridor, the staircase, and the heavy doors that led to the service quarters. Gone. Two went to check on her, and she wasn't there. The window was closed, locked. The door! It seemed undisturbed. Miss Eldridge's voice shook, betraying genuine fear. Halsted frowned. "A second victim, but why and how?" "The house is sealed. The staff have not left." Poirot stepped into the kitchen, his sharp eyes moving over every surface, noting minor details: the angle of a knife on the counter, a chair slightly pulled from the table, a faint smear of flour along the edge of the floorboards. Then he froze, noticing a small smudge on the polished brass of the fireplace bell, a bell used to call servants across the floors. It had been wiped clean, yet a faint streak remained, almost imperceptible to anyone less observant. "Ah," Poirot murmured, "the hand of the perpetrator is clever, yes, but it is never perfect." He knelt, tracing the smear delicately. "They have moved quickly, with purpose. Someone is attempting not just to hide evidence but to manipulate the household, to frighten, confuse, and remain always several steps ahead." Halsted followed. Tense. "Poirot, what does this mean? Another murder?" Poirot shook his head. "Not necessarily. Sometimes disappearance is as effective as death in creating fear and distraction, but the intent is the same: to destabilize the investigation, to test the limits of observation. Whoever acts thus is bold and confident." He rose, eyes scanning the stairwell. "Notice, Inspector, how the absence of Mrs. Hensley forces all attention upward, away from the study, away from the missing evidence, away from the first subtle clues. It is a diversionary masterstroke in psychological manipulation." Halsted swallowed hard. "And we are falling for it." Poirot's lips curled in the smallest of smiles. "We must appear to be, but in truth, we observe every detail, every hesitation, every distraction. Fear and urgency are tools that can blind the eye, yet they also betray the mind of the one who wields them." A sudden movement at the far window caught Poirot's attention. A curtain flickered, as if disturbed by a shadow passing behind it. His small hand twitched instinctively toward his pocket. "Ah." The game continues. Our culprit is not merely clever, he is audacious. He wishes us to believe the house is unstable, yet in reality he orchestrates every tremor with precision. Observe, my friend, the challenge is no longer only to solve a crime, but to prevent another from occurring before it is too late. Miss Eldridge's voice trembled again. "Sir..." She left a note, I think. It says, "Do not follow or time will betray you." Poirot read the hastily scribbled words, the mustache twitching. The clock that lied, and now words that warn. Our adversary is not merely hiding in the shadows. He anticipates our actions, predicts our reasoning. He knows the little grey cells, yes, but he also knows the human heart and how it reacts to fear. Halstead's eyes widened. A second crime, a warning. He's escalating. Poirot nodded, turning slowly to sweep the room with his sharp gaze. Exactly, mon ami. The stakes have changed. We are no longer observers of a past act alone, we are participants in a dangerous sequence. Each moment that passes is part of a larger design. The hand that struck once is preparing to strike again, and it is our task not merely to understand, but to anticipate, to intercept, and to reveal the truth before another life or secret is lost. The study clock ticked quietly somewhere in the distance, its hands still frozen at 9:17, as if mocking the urgency of the present. Poirot's eyes glimmered with determination. Now, my friend, the game truly begins. The day passed in a tense blur, the household restless and anxious under Poirot's unyielding gaze. Inspector Halstead moved from room to room, organizing searches, questioning staff again and again, but each attempt seemed to spiral into confusion. Yet Poirot, as always, observed silently, collecting the minutiae that others dismissed: the tilt of a chair, the slight unevenness in a rug, the subtle way Miss Eldridge wrung her hands when mentioning times or places. It was only late that afternoon, as the sunlight slanted across the study and cast long, distorted shadows of the clocks on the walls, that Poirot paused, as though struck by a sudden clarity. His eyes travelled over the room, lingering on the seemingly trivial objects he had inspected countless times. The pendulum still on its small table, the faint smudge near the fireplace, the indentation in the carpet beneath the desk, and the still frozen hands of the central clock. Then he remembered something that had struck him as odd in their earliest conversations: a small, almost throwaway remark made by Graves when asked about Mr. Fenwick's habits. The butler had mentioned casually that Fenwick liked to wind his clocks in a particular order, following the sequence from oldest to newest, beginning with the mantelpiece clock. At the time, it seemed a charming quirk, irrelevant to the investigation. But now, with the events of the second disappearance weighing on him, Poirot's mind connected the dots. He paced slowly, the soft leather soles of his shoes whispering against the polished floor. Every incident, every small disruption, the placement of the note, the missing revolver, the carefully orchestrated panic surrounding Mrs. Hensley's disappearance, was arranged around the clocks, around the pattern in which they were wound. Each action corresponded to a specific time or order of attention, exploiting the household's predictable habits and Fenwick's own peculiarities. "Ah, so simple, yet so cunning," Poirot murmured, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The criminal has not acted randomly. The order of the clocks, the placement of notes, the timing of disappearances all follow a rhythm that only one who understands both time and human predictability could exploit. He moved to the mantelpiece, tracing the edges of the oldest clock, then shifted to the desk, crouching to examine the indentation in the carpet once more. It was here, he realized, that the sequence became undeniable. The first crime had been staged at the precise moment when the staff's attention would be diverted, the note left as a lure, the missing revolver positioned to mislead, all corresponding to the order in which Fenwick's clocks were wound. The second incident, the sudden disappearance of Mrs. Hensley, was another beat in the same pattern, timed to create confusion and fear while keeping the real culprit comfortably steps ahead. Poirot straightened, his eyes narrowing with excitement and satisfaction. "The pattern is clear, Inspector. The key has been before our eyes all along. The criminal exploits the house itself, the routines, the very heartbeat of time here. Every deviation, every misdirection is calculated. And now, understanding the rhythm, we may predict the next move, or at least narrow the possibilities significantly." He paused, glancing at Halstead. "We must consider who among us possesses the knowledge, the patience, and the audacity to orchestrate such a sequence. The answer, my friend, is concealed not in the dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, unnoticed habits. Observe who understands the clocks intimately, who moves within the house with the precision of a metronome, and you will see the architect of this deception." Halstead frowned, clearly absorbing the implications. So the culprit has been hiding in plain sight, manipulating every moment, every reaction. Poirot's mustache twitched with a faint smile. Exactly. Sometimes the smallest, most seemingly insignificant detail, the order of winding clocks. A casual remark, a habitual motion is the lantern that illuminates the entire labyrinth. And now that the pattern emerges, we may at last begin to unravel the criminal's design, step by step, before another life or secret is lost. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the study seemed almost alive with anticipation. The clocks ticked steadily, each beat a reminder of the rhythm the perpetrator had imposed, and Poirot's keen eyes, finally seeing the hidden sequence, traced the invisible threads that would lead to the ultimate revelation. Poirot spent the rest of the day in quiet contemplation, retracing the pattern he had discovered, replaying each staff member's movements and remarks with meticulous precision. As evening fell and the gas lamps cast a warm glow across the polished wood of the study, he summoned Inspector Halsted to join him once more. Inspector, Poirot began, his tone calm but deliberate. We have observed the rhythm, the subtle manipulations, the careful timing. But to understand the crime fully, we must understand the mind behind it. And, mon ami, the mind is always revealed through its obsession. Halsted looked puzzled. Obsession? I thought this was about murder and misdirection. Yes, superficially, Poirot replied, his eyes gleaming. Yet the surface never tells the whole story. Observe carefully. The note, the missing revolver, the staged disappearance of Mrs. Hensley, they were not random acts of cruelty, nor merely designed to obscure a path to fortune. Each act was deliberate, designed to satisfy something deeper, something personal. One does not orchestrate such a sequence for money alone, nor for simple revenge. He gestured to the room, the frozen clock above the mantelpiece drawing their attention. The central motif is control. Control over time, over perception, over the reactions of others. The criminal is compelled not merely by desire for advantage, but by the need to manipulate, to dictate the very rhythm of life within this house. Such a need is profound, psychological, and dangerous. Halsted frowned. So it's a mind obsessed. Poirot nodded slowly. Mais oui, observed Graves, the butler. Consider his years of service, his intimate knowledge of every habit, every clock, every step within this house. It is not envy that drives him, nor greed. It is the irresistible compulsion to orchestrate, to impose order according to his own design. The deaths, the disappearances, the misleading clues, all are instruments in a performance where he alone controls the tempo, and all others are actors on a stage not of their choosing. He moved toward the desk, running a finger along the edge where the revolver had been. The note, the timing, the pendulum test, they were not merely to mislead us, but to satisfy this need to manipulate the world around him, to see fear and uncertainty ripple like waves across the household. The crime is therefore both a message and an assertion, a declaration that he, and he alone, dictates the rhythm of this environment. Halsted's face paled slightly. That's unnerving. So this wasn't about inheritance or revenge for some past slight. Only superficially, Poirot said, eyes narrowing. The external motives, money, position, even grudges, merely provided the framework, the plausible rationale. The true driving force is the internal one, a psychological compulsion to dominate, to choreograph the actions of others down to the smallest detail. That is why the crimes were so meticulous, so theatrically precise. It is a manifestation of a mind that craves absolute control and will go to extraordinary lengths to achieve it. Halsted exhaled, shaking his head. A dangerous kind of genius, then. Dangerous indeed, Poirot agreed. He turned back to the frozen clock, tapping lightly on the mantel. The hands of this clock did not merely freeze, they were a symbol, a mirror of the criminal's desire. Time paused, all eyes directed elsewhere, and yet the master of the house's rhythm remained unseen, manipulating every detail. He paused, eyes fixed intently on the invisible pattern he had pieced together in his mind. Now, with understanding of the mind, the pattern, and the motivations revealed, we may predict the final act. The criminal cannot resist the compulsion to act according to his obsession. We must be ready for the culmination, Inspector, for the final deception is near, and the hand that orchestrates all will soon reveal itself either through hubris or the inevitability of human nature. Halsted nodded grimly. So we're not just solving a crime, we're anticipating the mind behind it. Poirot smiled faintly, the twitch of his mustache betraying satisfaction. Exactly, mon ami. For the mind that constructs such intricate designs leaves its trace, its rhythm, its signature. And once that signature is recognized, the hidden motiveth deepest, darkest compulsion cannot hide any longer. Now, we await the final revelation, and the exposure of the hand that has dared to control time itself. The study was silent, except for the faint ticking of clocks, both real and imagined, as Poirot's eyes gleamed with certainty. The criminal's psychology had been exposed, and with it, the path to justice had never been clearer. Poirot spent the remainder of the evening arranging the pieces of the puzzle in his mind, the rhythm of Grosvenor Square's clocks echoing faintly through the quiet house. Every detail, the frozen hands of the mantelpiece clock, the missing revolver, the staged disappearance of Mrs. Hensley, was now part of a coherent sequence, a carefully orchestrated pattern of obsession. By midnight, he had determined the precise moment when the criminal would attempt the final act, believing all would remain concealed until morning. He summoned Inspector Halstead to the drawing-room, where the staff had been gathered under polite but anxious observation. "Mon ami," he said, "we now have all we need. The rhythm, the habits, the obsessions, everything points to the culmination. The final move will be made by one who cannot resist the compulsion to control, and we shall be ready." Halstead nodded, a mix of anticipation and unease in his eyes. "You believe we can catch them in the act?" Poirot's lips curved in a small, confident smile. "Mais oui. Patience, observation, and precise timing, these are the instruments of justice." He directed the staff to return to their quarters, instructing them that nothing was to be disturbed. The house seemed to settle into an uneasy stillness, the shadows stretching long under the lamplight. Poirot moved to the study, checking every detail. The positioning of the pendulum, the faint indentation in the carpet beneath the desk, the subtly displaced book on the shelf. He crouched to examine the smudge on the fireplace brass, tracing it lightly with a gloved finger. Everything was in place. Hours passed, each tick of the clock heightening the tension. Then, just past 1 in the morning, a sound broke the silence. A careful, measured step from the corridor outside the study. Poirot remained perfectly still, eyes narrowing. The step was deliberate, yet silent, almost as if its owner wished to test the household's vigilance. Graves, the butler, entered the room, his movements precise, gloved hands clasping something concealed beneath his coat. He paused at the center of the study, unaware of the detective's presence. Poirot's eyes followed every micro-expression, the slight flare of nostrils, the tightening of the jaw, the subtle hesitation before he moved again. "Bonsoir, monsieur," Poirot said softly, stepping from the shadows. His voice carried no accusation, only calm observation. Graves froze. The object in his hand shifted slightly, revealing the missing revolver. A flicker of panic crossed his otherwise composed face. Monsieur Poirot," he stammered. You were only confirming your control," Poirot said, his tone light yet cutting. "You could not resist arranging the scene, controlling every detail, seeing fear ripple through others. But in your eagerness to dominate, you have left the smallest imperfection, a trace of hesitation, a mark of the human hand." Graves' shoulders slumped. You know everything." His voice shook, anger and fear mingling. "I followed his patterns, yes. I kept the order of the clocks, the sequence of the notes. I did it to prove that I could orchestrate it perfectly, to feel the power of knowing everyone else is blind." Poirot nodded, eyes steady. "Indeed, the compulsion, the obsession, it was never about money nor simple revenge. It was control, the mastery of time, perception, and human emotion. You could not resist imposing your rhythm upon the household." The butler's hands trembled as he released the revolver. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, except to teach them, to show them." "But the pattern is broken," the game concluded, "and justice will follow its course." Halstead entered at that moment, ushering Graves forward. The tension in the room dissolved slowly, replaced by relief. Poirot straightened, glancing once more at the mantelpiece clock, its hands still frozen, a silent witness to the orchestration of obsession and the triumph of reason. The house, finally calm, seemed to exhale. Poirot's gaze softened, the small twitch of his mustache betraying satisfaction. The case was solved. The rhythm of fear and manipulation had ended, and the careful, deliberate order of the little grey cells had revealed the truth hidden in the shadows of Grosvenor Square. The house had settled into an uneasy calm. The staff gathered quietly in the drawing-room, some whispering nervously, others simply relieved that the tension seemed to have passed. Graves had been escorted by Inspector Halstead to the station, his confession recorded, the revolver reclaimed, and the note recovered. Poirot, standing in the study, allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, though he knew well that appearances could be deceiving. Yet, as he examined the pendulum still swinging gently on the table, a faint unease pricked at him. Something did not align. The confession had been flawless, the story coherent, but Poirot's little grey cells, ever vigilant, noticed a small inconsistency he had overlooked before. The movements of the clocks, the timing of Mrs. Hensley's disappearance, the subtle smudge on the fireplace graves had confessed to orchestrating the sequence. Yet one small detail in the household did not fit the pattern. Poirot turned sharply. "Inspector," he said, beckoning Halstead back into the study, "there is one matter we must review." Halstead frowned. "What now, Poirot? I thought everything was concluded." "Ah, that is precisely why I am concerned," Poirot replied, his voice measured. "Graves has confessed, yes, but a truly meticulous mind, obsessed with control, does not overlook the simplest variables. Yet the placement of the note, the revolver, and the staged disappearance all were executed according to the same order. But one item, left seemingly insignificant, remains unexplained." He picked up the mantelpiece clock, turning it gently in his hands. Observe Graves could manipulate the clocks he touched. But this clock, monsieur, remained untouched, its hands frozen before any crime took place. And yet, the final note, the one that caused panic during Mrs. Hensley's disappearance, corresponds precisely to this clock. How could Graves, entering only at the night's events, place it with such exact timing? The answer, mon ami, is that he could not. Halstead blinked. "Then... someone else?" Poirot's eyes glimmered with intensity. "Mais oui. Someone who understood both the patterns of the household and the obsessions of Graves. Someone who anticipated his compulsion to act and used it to their own advantage. Graves, as meticulous as he is, became a pawn in a larger design." The detective's gaze swept the room, lingering on each member of the staff. And then it fell on Miss Eldridge, the maid, whose nervousness had seemed simply timidity. Yet now her hands clutched her apron tightly, her eyes betraying a faint, careful calculation. "Ah," Poirot said softly, stepping closer. "You, Miss Eldridge, were aware of Mr. Fenwick's habits, were you not? You observed the clocks, you observed the household, and you anticipated the actions of the one who craved control. You allowed Graves to follow his compulsion, knowing he would create the sequence, and you manipulated the final note to incite fear, to test the household's reactions, and to cover your own role." Miss Eldridge's face paled, a flash of defiance crossing her features, quickly replaced by resignation. I did not intend to harm anyone. I thought I could guide it safely, to prevent worse chaos. I underestimated him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot nodded, the twitch of his mustache betraying his satisfaction. "Precisely. The ultimate orchestration was yours. Graves executed the pattern, yes, but under your guidance, your subtle hand. You exploited his obsession, and yet you believed the blame would remain hidden. That is the genius of the final twist. The apparent criminal is revealed, but the true mastermind is revealed only when the smallest detail is scrutinized." Halstead exhaled sharply. "So the case isn't as simple as we thought. Graves confessed, but the real design was hers." "Exactly," Poirot said, eyes sharp and unwavering. "The game is concluded, but justice requires that every thread, every mind that played, be accounted for. The little grey cells have revealed the hidden pattern, the obsessive mind, and the subtle hand that guided it all. Even in the shadows of deception, truth will shine." Miss Eldridge lowered her gaze, and the room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clocks. Poirot straightened, hands clasped lightly, satisfied that the final revelation had unfolded as only careful observation and unerring logic could reveal. The game had tested his genius to its limits, but once again he had discerned the rhythm of deception and exposed the hidden architect behind the shadows of Grosvenor Square. The morning sunlight streamed weakly through the curtains of Grosvenor Square, illuminating a house still steeped in tension. The staff remained gathered, their whispers hushed, as Inspector Halstead moved briskly to complete the formalities of arrest. Graves had been escorted away the previous night, and Miss Eldridge now stood quietly in the center of the drawing-room, the weight of revelation pressing upon her small frame. Her eyes, once confident with subtle cunning, now held the unmistakable glaze of fear. Poirot, standing with his hands folded neatly, surveyed the room. "Mess Amis," he began, his voice calm, precise. "The labyrinth of deceit has been traversed, and yet one must ask, why were these threads so nearly invisible to all others? Why did the path to truth require not brute force, but the patient observation of the subtle, the overlooked?" He moved slowly through the room, gesturing gently to objects and details that had been dismissed as irrelevant. "Observe this mantelpiece clock, its hands frozen, yet central to the orchestration. Its seeming immobility was a beacon to the observant eye, a rhythm that dictated the timing of events. And see her, the small smudge upon the brass, the nearly imperceptible indentation in the carpet beneath the desk. These were clues ignored in haste, yet they revealed the presence and movements of those who manipulated the house with careful precision." Halstead frowned. "So everything we thought we knew, the evidence, the confessions, it was all part of the same orchestration?" "Exactly," Poirot replied. "Graves, driven by obsession, executed the sequence, yet he was guided subtly, manipulated by a hand patient enough to understand both the environment and the psychology of the other players. Miss Eldridge's intervention was not immediately obvious. She exploited the compulsion of Graves, allowing him to act, yet she orchestrated the critical details of the note, the timing of the secondary disappearances so as to mask her influence and test the household's reactions." The maid's face tightened, a blush of shame or perhaps resignation. I didn't kill anyone," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I only wanted to prevent more harm. I thought, controlling it carefully. I thought I could manage it." Poirot's eyes softened slightly, but his tone remained unwavering. "Ah! But in the manipulation of others, control is always illusory. One cannot govern compulsion without consequence. Yet it is precisely this interplay, the seen and the unseen, the executed and the guided, that demonstrates why the crime unfolded with such subtlety. The chaos was never random, it was an expression of mind, of obsession, of foresight applied to human nature." Halstead nodded slowly. "So justice is served?" Poirot allowed a faint smile. "Justice is pursued, yes. Graves and Miss Eldridge will answer for their actions. Yet let us not pretend the resolution is simple. The subtlety of deception means that the mind can, even in confinement, preserve the satisfaction of its orchestration. There is always a shadow of unfinished business, for human nature is never fully tamed. That is why the attentive observer who notices what others dismiss remains indispensable." He gestured to the study, the clocks, the pendulum swinging gently. Every object, every habit, every quirk contributed to a tapestry of truth. Those who looked only at the overt events missed the rhythm, the hidden patterns that guided the actions. Yet it is in those very patterns that the clever mind of a detective finds the solution, step by step, until the final revelation is undeniable. A hush fell over the room as Poirot's gaze swept slowly across the assembled staff, lingering with the faintest spark of triumph. "The game is concluded," he said softly, "but the lesson endures. The world is full of minutiae, subtle indications, and rhythms that only the patient observant eye can discern. The little grey cells, mes amis, are ever watchful, ever capable of revealing what the eyes alone cannot see." Outside, the City of London carried on oblivious to the intricate drama that had played out in Grosvenor Square. Inside, the house seemed to exhale, the clocks ticking steadily once more, marking time that had been manipulated, understood, and, at last, illuminated. The truth had been revealed, the pattern unraveled, and yet, as always, Poirot knew the delicate balance of justice and human complexity left the faintest shadow of uncertainty, a reminder that vigilance, observation, and reason were never-ending companions in the pursuit of truth. The morning had grown brighter, though a soft London fog lingered, curling along the streets and softening the edges of Grosvenor Square. Poirot stood at the threshold of the house, his coat buttoned neatly, his hat tipped at a careful angle. Inspector Halstead followed, satisfied yet still a little bewildered by the intricate web they had untangled. The arrests were made, the notes and revolver recovered, and the household slowly returning to the rhythms of normality. Yet Poirot paused, his eyes scanning the garden below the windows, the shadows cast by the low winter sun. A subtle detail tugged at the back of his mind, a minute inconsistency in Miss Eldridge's story, something almost imperceptible. It was not enough to mar the resolution, but enough to plant a seed of curiosity. He noticed how her eyes flickered, briefly, toward a side table in the parlor, then away, as though fearful it might betray something more. He made a mental note, not as an accusation, but as a reminder that even the most orderly unraveling of deceit often leaves a thread loose. He turned to Halstead. "Inspector, the house appears calm, yes. The principal players accounted for. Yet, mon ami, the world of mystery is never entirely tidy. The smallest gesture, the faintest irregularity, can conceal an entire narrative yet to unfold. One must always remain attentive, for the game of observation continues, even after the apparent conclusion." Halstead glanced at him, curiosity mingling with lingering tension. "You mean there's still something we're missing?" Poirot's mustache twitched with the tiniest smile. "Perhaps not missing, but incomplete. The criminal mind is clever, yes, but human. Even the most meticulous plan leaves the possibility of discovery in some overlooked detail. A mark, a glance, a rhythm noticed too late, these are seeds for the next revelation." He adjusted his gloves, looking back one last time at the study, where the pendulum still swung with perfect, honest cadence. "Observe, Inspector, the clocks mark time faithfully. They tell the hours, the minutes, the seconds, but in their silence they whisper stories, the choices, the errors, the hidden obsessions. One could spend a lifetime listening and still hear new truths." Halstead exhaled slowly, following Poirot's gaze. "So even with the case seemingly closed, you're saying the mystery, it never truly ends?" "Exactly," Poirot said, his eyes glimmering with quiet certainty. "For each answer uncovered, there is another subtle question waiting. For every villain exposed, there is a hint, a shadow, a gesture that might suggest yet another plot, another deception, perhaps in a place not yet considered. It is why the little grey cells must remain ever alert, and why the detective's work is never truly done." He began walking down the steps, his posture composed, each movement deliberate. The fog began to lift, revealing the streets of London with a clarity that belied the complexities of the house behind him. As he moved toward the carriage that would take him away, a folded piece of paper, long unnoticed, slipped from the edge of the parlor mantelpiece. He bent slightly, retrieved it, and read the cryptic words hastily scrawled. "Time reveals, yet hides all. The game is never over." A faint smile curved Poirot's lips, almost imperceptible, as he carefully folded the note and placed it in his coat pocket. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured under his breath. "Even in conclusion, there is anticipation. Even in victory, the next puzzle waits. One must savor the resolution while preparing for the new game. Such is the life of a detective and the world of mystery, where nothing is ever truly finished." The carriage door closed behind him, and as it rolled away along the fog-draped streets, the shadows of Grosvenor Square lingered in the distance, silent witnesses to the unraveling of secrets and the promise of enigmas yet to come. Poirot sat back, mustache twitching with satisfaction, mind already attuned to rhythms unseen, aware that for every solved crime, a subtle question awaited its answer, and that the mysteries of London would never truly sleep.